This evening, our presentation is going to be on grief and loss as it relates to kinship guardians and kinship families. And our presenter is Derek Rugsacken. He is a licensed professional clinical counselor. All right, Derek, I'll turn it over to you.
So today, this is what we are going to be talking about in our presentation. First, we're going to define what we're talking about when we refer to grief and loss. Then we will be exploring the different types of loss that people might experience. We will be talking about how grief might show up. And this is how grief might show up in people of different ages across the lifespan and what that might look like. Then we'll be talking about the pathway through the grieving process and the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who is a well-known grief researcher. And then we will finish up by talking about the supports and resources that you might be able to connect with if you find yourself in the process of grief and loss. So first, we would like to define grief and loss. And to do this, we have a quote, which I'll read for you now. It says, "Grief is like the ocean. It comes in waves, ebbing and flowing. Sometimes the water is calm and sometimes it is overwhelming. All we can do is learn to swim." And that's by Vicki Harrison. So again, what is grief? A more clinical answer to that question says that grief is a natural response to loss. It's the emotional suffering you feel when something or someone you love is taken away. So this is what we mean when we refer to grief in this presentation. So there are many different types of grief. Of course, the one that we know about and think about most commonly is the first one on this list, death of a loved one. But there are many other types of grief, and here are some examples. A divorce or breakup in the family, the loss of one's health, losing a job, losing financial stability, miscarriage, retirement, the death of a pet, the loss of a cherished dream, a loved one's serious illness, the loss of a friendship, the loss of safety after a trauma, and selling the family home. These can all be different types of grief that we might experience in our lifetime. So one thing we want to acknowledge at the top of this presentation is that kinship families face unique types of loss. And we're going to be talking about some of that and the ways that the loss is unique with kinship families in this presentation. So some of the loss that is specific to kin caregivers, the types of loss are interrupted life cycles and the postponement of plans. You may have expected one type of life and taken on a different one when you took on the children in your life. Intrusions on your space and privacy. We can all relate to that with children. We have changes in roles and the role you thought you would have versus the one you might have. Changes in priorities, life priorities. Time for peers decreases. So less social time for you is what that means. And relationship changes with biological parents. So sometimes taking on the role changes your relationship to the biological parents. So here we have another quote from the Child Welfare League of America, and it says, "Too often, caregivers deny, minimize, and repress their losses out of feelings of obligation, loyalty, and responsibility to the child or parent." And in psychology, we call this compartmentalizing, but it's sort of putting your own losses aside out of a feeling of duty to the people that you're serving. So children in kinship care experience their own unique types of loss. And here we have a short list of examples of what that might look like. So for the children in kinship care, very often they're losing their parents or losing their siblings. They're no longer in relationship to those individuals. They might be losing privacy and space. They might have to share a room or take on a different space than they're used to. They have the loss of normalcy. It's the life they knew. They may not have that life anymore. They may not have certain things that their friends at school have, or certain days like parent days are going to look different for them, such as in school. They may have the loss of place in the family, whatever their role or place was in the previous family situation will change when they join a new family. They may also have the loss of the caregiver's previous role. So a grandparent might become a parent, an aunt and uncle might become a parent, a family friend might also become a parent. And so they go from one role to the next. Also changes in relationships with family members. A grandchild, again, becomes a child in that moment. A niece or nephew then becomes a child of the family. And so those relationships will also change. And with that comes also a feeling of loss often. So some of you might know this. This might be news to some of you, but our state of New Mexico ranks second in the nation for childhood bereavement, with 1 in 10 children experiencing the death of a parent or sibling by age 18. And that comes to us by way of the Children's Grief Center. And that is a statistical reality that we face here in New Mexico. So now we're going to go through some myths about grief and loss, and we're going to compare those against the facts to sort of debunk the myths, so to speak. So the first myth that we have here is the idea that the pain will go away faster if you ignore it. And what we actually know from our studies and our research is that trying to ignore your pain or keeping it from surfacing will only make it worse in the long run. For real healing, it is necessary to face your grief and actively deal with it, actively engage with it. Another myth is that it's important to be strong in the face of loss. A lot of times we feel that we have to be strong in the face of a loss in our life. And the fact is that feeling sad, frightened, or lonely is a completely normal reaction to loss. Crying does not mean that we are weak. You do not need to protect your family or friends by putting on a brave front. Showing your true feelings can help both them and you share in the processing of that loss. Another myth is that if you don't cry, you aren't sorry about the loss. Well, the fact is that crying is a completely normal response to sadness, but is not the only way to respond to loss. Those who don't cry may feel the pain just as deeply as the others. They may show it differently. They may have different ways of showing it or different ways of expressing it. There are multiple ways to express grief and loss, and crying is just one of those. Another myth says that moving on means forgetting about your loss. Well, the fact is that moving on means that you have accepted your loss, and accepting is not the same as forgetting. You can keep the memory as an important part of you, and these memories can eventually become integral to defining who we are as a person. Another myth says that grieving should last about a year, when in fact, there's actually no specific time frame for grieving, and how long the grief process takes will differ from person to person. So now we'd like to talk a little bit about what grief looks like in children. Children will express grief in different ways than adults. And these are just a few examples of how that might look. So young children actually have difficulty sitting with very strong feelings for long, especially very young children from the ages of toddler to about 5. And they will quickly switch into something else, like playing or looking for something to eat or changing the subject. This is completely normal for children of that age. And it does not mean that they are not experiencing grief because they're switching from one thing to the next. Young children might also display increased crying and irritability around grief. They might often ask questions, and frequently they'll ask the same question over and over, trying to understand them. Children might exhibit social withdrawal, meaning their teacher will mention that they spend their time alone at school, or you'll see them spending a lot of their time alone at home, not playing with others. They may also exhibit changes in eating or sleeping habits. So for very young children, these are some of the ways that grief is expressed. Going back to the idea of myths about grief, now we have some myths about grief in children that are commonly held. So one of those is that an active playing child is not a grieving child. Again, as we previously discussed, the fact is that this is simply not true. A child who is grieving will very likely be active in playing because this is how they function. This is how they process extreme feelings. And they switch from thing to thing rapidly. Another myth is that grief and mourning occurs in an orderly fashion. And again, so this simply isn't the case. Grief and mourning don't follow a prescribed routine or a set of steps. They may be different in different people. Some children may not feel the feelings for quite a long time. And other children may feel the feelings right away. And they may come in at different times and in different orders. This is normal. Another myth about grief in children is that adults should avoid topics that cause a child to cry, when in fact, this also is not helpful to the child or to the adult. Talking openly with children about grief is also very important for their process of grieving. And lastly is the myth that children just need to get over it and move on. When in fact, children are human beings just like the rest of us. And they need to process grief in the same, not in the exact same way, but just as much as adults do. Another myth about grief in children is that children are better off not attending funerals and memorials. And grief researchers have actually stated that it's psychologically much better for a child to attend the funeral, to have a real sense for the loss, to admit the loss and not try to hide it or cover it up. And that they need to know what's going on and have a clear sense of that. Another myth says that the grief of an adult does not impact a bereaved child. I think anyone who's ever had a close relationship with a child probably knows better than that. That the adult relationship with the child is everything. It's a huge part of their life. And the grief of an adult, of course, has an impact on the bereaved child and also probably their behavior. The last myth we have here is that parents and educators are always prepared and qualified to give explanations and clarifications regarding loss. When the fact is actually that's also simply not true. Parents and educators share, I think, the same sort of confusion about how to explain these things to children. Loss is a complicated subject. It's not easy to explain. And so I think that we have to realize that we are no better equipped than others to explain that. So kind of going back, and I had spoken a little bit about this in the previous slides, but these are just some ideas about what a grieving child might need from us, the adults and the caregivers in their lives. How can we support children in a positive way in their grieving process? Well, the first bit of advice that is given here by a woman, Jenny Thomas, who's a well-known grief counselor and researcher from the UK. She says that direct, honest information about the loss is critical, that we don't try and rephrase it or say that the person has gone to sleep or the person has gone away. But we tell them directly that the person has died or the thing has happened, and that we don't hold back in being direct and compassionately honest about what has happened. Also, the ability to talk about the subject of the loss. Children have reported that this has been very important for them in processing grief. The ability to actually talk about it. I think losing someone or something is a painful thing. It can be difficult to talk about. But it is very important that children have a space where they can talk about it. Whether that's at home or in another safe social space. Children need the patience to answer questions even if they're asked multiple times. I think very often it can be difficult for an adult to have the same conversation multiple times. We tend to have one conversation, one and done, and then we've talked about it, and it's tabled. Well, children, part of the way they process is by repetition. So they may need to have the same conversation multiple times, and they simply need you to respond in the same way each time. That's what they're looking for from you, the caregiver. When children experience loss, they also need positive messages about who they are, such as, you are such a thoughtful person. You are such a kind, considerate person. Don't make something up, but tell them something true about themselves that is reaffirming about who they are. You are so good at sharing. You are so good at helping around the house, things of that nature. They also need positive messages about who they have in their life. You have your grandparents, your aunts, your uncles, your brothers and sisters who still care very much about you. They need to be reassured of who they have when a loss has occurred. So we've just talked about young children and how grief shows up in the younger children. Now we're going to move on to the adolescents, moving into the teenage years. So teens, different than younger children, they can be a lot more isolated in their grief. As they are growing into more independent humans, they may choose to slam a door or hole up in their room instead of coming to you, the caregivers or adults, for comfort. Where a younger child will more openly seek comfort from you, a teenager may pull back. They may also exhibit acting out behaviors during a grieving time. These may include substance abuse, verbal or physical aggression, self-harm. Teens may turn to social media for grief support, since so much of teen life happens online and in social media these days. It may also be where they go for support around these things. Teens are also further along in their own development of their identity and of self. So they might also have some spiritual questioning that arises during this time. When someone is lost or a life changes drastically, they teens might need space to question what they believe at this time. And so being able to support teens in that conversation can be very important. So now we're talking a little bit about what grieving adolescents may need from us, the adults and caregivers, in the process of grief. Well, number one is a sense of normalcy. Teens, more than anything, want to feel like they're normal, like they're not the odd one out. They want to feel like everyone else. And so a great way to get this when you're a grieving adolescent is through grief groups or camps that engage with grief, or as we said before, safe forums online, and they do exist. We do have to be very careful with grief support online because there are very unhealthy communities around that type of subject, but there are also communities that are curated and safe for adolescents to process grief. We've put an example of one of these up here. It's called hellogrief.org, which you might like to write down if you have a adolescent who's affected by grief and loss. And that's a positive, moderated site where adolescents can go to share in their grief experiences. Another thing that was suggested for grieving adolescents is consistent expectations at home. What they said, what the research said actually, is that children feel more secure when the expectations stay more or less the same way before and after the grief event. So that we don't just drop the rules and let them get away with anything they want during this time. Teens have actually reported this makes them feel less secure when they lose the rules. So the rules we want to more or less hold in place, again, compassionately, with an understanding that they're also going through a lot. Yeah. Again, as we said before, the ability to explore their spirituality in an open and honest way is very important for teens, to explore what they believe and what this experience means to them. To have open conversations is very important for teens at this time. Additionally, grieving adolescents may need referrals to teachers with whom they have a connection, or counselors, or healthcare professionals when the concerns are more serious, when you're seeing behaviors or tendencies in the adolescent that worry you for their safety. Consider external referrals at this time. So we've talked about the younger children, and we've talked about the teens. Now we are going to talk about what grief looks like in adults. Any of us who have ever experienced loss or grief in our own lives, I think will be able to relate to these things. I know that I can personally relate to my own experiences of grief when looking at these items. One of the first things that we notice in the experience of grief is often changes in our emotions and in our thought processes. It's very common to experience shock, disbelief, depressed mood, emotional pain, difficulty concentrating, anger, guilt, or irritability. And again, this is just a suggested list. You may experience any other variety of thoughts or feelings. We might experience behavioral changes. These can range from agitation, restlessness, slowing down, withdrawing from normal activities that we used to enjoy, picking up health compromising behaviors such as smoking and drinking. We might experience interpersonal and social changes. And now this will depend on the age and the social context of where we are in life. If we're younger, we might lose contact with some of our work friends, our work social groups, things of that nature. You know, if we're older, we might lose contact with some of our social groups, our churches, things of this nature during that time. Additionally, one thing that a lot of people may not realize, especially with men, is that physical complaints are a symptom of grief. body aches and pains, gastrointestinal issues, changes in eating and sleeping patterns. These actual physical symptoms can arise out of our experience of grief. Our CEO, Craig Pierce, often likes to say, however, that we also cannot talk about grief and trauma without talking about resilience. And resilience is how we, as humans, survive and move through the experience of grief and loss. So here we have a little diagram that illustrates what the experience of grief can be like. And it's a little humorous, but also a little true. On the left, we have the roadmap you expected. And here we have the stages of grief as outlined by Elizabeth Gillow-Ross, who I mentioned at the top of the presentation, the grief researcher: denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance. And on the right, we have the road you got, what grief actually feels like. It's a topsy-turvy, curvy, non-directional road. And the way that we move through it is not at all a straight line. It is not a clean experience in that way. And it's different. That curly cue is going to look different for each of us. So in talking about our resilience, we also have to talk about our protective factors. And protective factors are exactly what they sound like. Factors that protect us from being completely submerged by our grief and loss. And so some of these factors can include stress management, our ability to manage stress, our access to concrete support, and that's support that is reliable, responsive, and actually helpful to us. Hopefulness, a sense of hope, a sense that as hard as it is, that we do have a lot to live for. Problem-solving skills, the ability to just manage problems, come up with solutions, having a solution focus. And also parenting skills. Parenting skills can be protective factors for children in helping teach effective coping strategies. So the last list was individual protective factors, factors that we can have on an individual level. These are called relational protective factors that exist within our relationships. So having peer relationships is itself a protective factor. Having friends, having a community, having things we participate in, we're a part of, and that we engage in, this is protective to us. Reduced isolation, things that pull us out of our tendency to want to isolate and be alone, is protective. Having positive relationships with extended family. I want to emphasize this doesn't mean we have to be on great terms with all of our extended family, but if we have strong connections with parts of our extended family, if we feel that there are healthy connections within that system, that's protective for us also. The ability to communicate emotions effectively is a protective factor. This is our ability to communicate to others what it is we're going through, and to do it in a way that's effective, not by lashing out or not by shutting down, but by being able to say honestly and directly, this is what I'm going through. This is what I'm feeling. And a step further would be, this is what I need, which can be very hard to do when we're in the depths of grief. That ability is a protective factor. Again, social engagements, going back to this relates to the first one, our peer relationships, but this is our school community, our faith community, any other community engagements or connections that we might have. These are all protective in our experience of grief. There's also secure caregiver-child relationships. We like to say that there is no more effective neurobiological intervention than secure caregiver-child relationships. And what that means in normal English is that there is no medicine, no medication, no psychological treatment you can do that is more effective for a child in their mental, emotional healing than having a safe, secure caregiver-child relationship. And so it's in that relationship that so much strength and so much resilience can be cultivated and fostered for the child. So now we have a quote about grief and coping, which I will read to you now. So it says, cry whenever you need to. Scream, shout, lay on the floor, sob in the shower. Be still, run, walk, create, live your truth, share without fear, listen, release your pain, breathe, be courageous, throw away the map, wander, be real, be compassionate, read, seek friendship, be vulnerable, don't fear being broken. These come to us from Zoe Clark Coates, who writes The Guide to Surviving Grief. And these are just some suggestions that she offers in her writing. Here we have another quote that describes grief in some beautiful language. It says, grief, I've learned, is really just love. It's all the love you want to give, but cannot. All that unspent love gathers up in the corners of your eyes, the lump in your throat, and in that hollow part of your chest. Grief is just love with no place to go. I really love that quote. Sometimes poetry can capture the truth even better than literal writing can. I think this is a good example of that for those of us who have ever experienced grief. So here we wanted to mention that there are many walks of life and many ways to honor the loss in our lives. Here we have a picture of a traditional ofrenda, which is one cultural way to do this. You may have the same or different ways to honor loss in your own life, but as another one of those protective factors that we talked about, we encourage you to also create a space to honor the loss in your life, to honor the memory that is a part of you and who you are. And here we have some resources and supports that we thought would be helpful for anyone who is or has been affected by grief and loss. First, we have the Grief Resource Center, which can be found at griefnm.org. That is one of the largest grief resources in the state of New Mexico, and you can find a variety of different types of grief resources there. Connected to that also is the Children's Grief Center, which can be found at childrensgrief.org. This is resources, of course, specifically directed towards children. We also have the book Parenting Through Grief by Jade Richardson Bach and Dr. Craig Pierce. As I mentioned, Dr. Craig Pierce is a wonderful CEO at Southwest Family Guidance Center who wrote this book. We also have Jenny Thomas, who was also mentioned previously. She has a great website full of resources that you can read, as well as podcasts, which are, just audio that you can listen to on various topics related to children and grief. We also have outpatient therapy and CCSS services offered at Southwest Family Guidance Center. of which the Fostering Family Program is a part. And you can visit us at swfamily.com. And there you can find referral forms if you would like to self-refer for individual or family therapy, or CCSS services, which stands for Comprehensive Community Support. It's a non-clinical service that helps with a variety of supports that are not clinical and not directly related to mental health, and more related to life skills, coping, and developing skills in all areas of life. There are also grief resources and centers statewide. I was pleasantly surprised to see that when I did a Google search on grief resources in New Mexico, there are actually quite a lot more than I expected to find. And they're located across the state. I encourage you to get online and do a Google search yourself to see also what else is in your area, because you also might be pleasantly surprised at what you find. Also, it's very important to mention that we at the Fostering Family, we also facilitate a peer support group that happens twice a month. That is every first and third Wednesday of the month at 6 p.m. That happens virtually, and you are all invited to join. It is a wonderful place for kinship caregivers to come, share their experiences, receive support, and also share the wisdom of their experience. We've had some really wonderful experiences with peers, with kinship caregiver peers supporting each other through their experience. And we would love to see any and all of you in the peer support group, which actually the first one of the month happens tomorrow at the same time, 6 p.m. If you're interested in that, please let us know in the chat, and we will be happy to send you information on how to join that group. So that is the English peer support group. This is another way, if you would like to, if you have interest in the peer support group, you can also contact Jesse Ortega at the email listed here, jortega@swfamily.com. And if you are Spanish speaking or know families who are Spanish speaking and are kinship caregivers, they can contact Itzel Barrera at the email listed below, ibarrera@swfamily.com. Also, we are offering virtual trainings throughout the year and into next year for topics that are related to kinship caregiving. As you know, today we are here talking about grief and loss, and you can see the roster of exciting topics that we have coming up next. These will be every first Tuesday of every month until next May. And again, if you have interest, you can find the information on our website, fosteringfamily.com, where you can find not only information about our ongoing training series, but also about all of the different offerings we have in our program. It's a great resource if you would like to know more about what we do here at the Fostering Family.